Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today we kick off our Series 10 content on this channel. We're actually trying something a little bit new, and so yeah, this is the first time I'm making content like this, and I definitely welcome any feedback for videos like this. But basically, I've always wanted to do event/tournament coverage and also just analyze the metagame at certain points in a format. Now, Series 10 hasn't actually officially started in-game. That kicks off on August 1st, but the format was announced a couple of weeks ago, so a lot of players have actually been practicing and kind of putting together teams already. And Victory Road, one of the premier VGC Grassroots organizations, actually held a really big online tournament this past weekend for Series 10, and over 400 players participated in it. So I figured this would be a really great way to get you all acclimated with the format, give you a snapshot of how top players are approaching the format, and also look at some of the top performing teams. So I think in this video, my plan is to go over the top 8 teams. The Victory Road kindly included paste of all the top 32 teams, which is really cool. So I've linked that down in the description below. And I'll also go over usage stats for the tournament, and then finally take a look at some other standout teams that I personally find really, really interesting. So yeah, I hope that you find this content educational and valuable. I really welcome any feedback here because I definitely would like to do more stuff like this. And like I said, this is my first time trying it out. So if you could leave a comment on, what you liked about it, what you think can be improved, definitely let me know in the comment section below. And if you do enjoy, please share support by leaving a like. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help me show that people are interested in content like this. So yeah, that's pretty much it, and I'm really excited to start Series 10. This format's obviously very different from anything we've played, and for a quick reminder for those that don't know, Series 10 is basically the same as Series 8, but no more Dynamax. So you're allowed one restricted Pokemon. That already is pretty unique, just because in other years of VGC with restricted Pokemon, you would be allowed up to 2. So you're only allowed 1, and there's no more Dynamax. And obviously, Dynamax was the main mechanic in Sword and Shield, and so games are going to look very different from what you might be used to if you only started playing VGC in Sword and Shield. So that's a quick recap of Series 10. So let's just dive into things. First of all, this tournament was organized by Victory Road, who, if you don't follow, you definitely should. They're constantly organizing really cool grassroots events, and they are just one of the premier VGC resources and hubs for information. A really professional group of people who are running the organization as well. So I've linked their Twitter and their website down in the description below. As I mentioned, this tournament had over 400 players in it, which is really, really cool, and it took place this past weekend. So it was classic Swiss plus single elimination in the bracket stage. So let's look at the actual teams. So like I mentioned, I want to look at the pastes for all of the top 8 teams and then dive into some of the usage statistics for this tournament. So first of all, let's cover the winning team used by Emmanuel. This is a really, really cool team, and I would not have expected Palkia to win a 400-person online tournament to start off Series 10. So there wasn't too much on the line for this event. Basically, you could see that the top players earned some money, but for the most part, this was really just a great way for players to get practice and get acclimated with the format. And the winning team, used and built by Emmanuel, has a lot of really interesting stuff here. First of all, we have to talk about Palkia. I did not expect Palkia to be a, potential, like, Pokemon winning, or a Pokemon that has the potential to win, like, a major tournament right from the start, but Emmanuel has demonstrated that it is a Pokemon that people might be sleeping on a little bit, including me, in the early format. So you might be wondering, like, what is the point of using Palkia? And if you've played other years of restricted formats in VGC, Palkia was never really very good in any of those. It was always kind of like middle tier, where, like, you've seen some teams with it succeed, but, it was never able to stand up and consistently win against all the top restricteds. One thing that makes Series 10 very different is that you no longer have things like the Primals, no Mega Rayquaza, for example, and Xerneas is a little bit weaker, right? Xerneas' existence alone made Palkia's life a little bit more difficult, and Xerneas actually has made a huge comeback in this format, but since you're only allowed 1 restricted Pokemon, that means that the rest of your team has a lot of room to, be built so that they can actually be offensive Pokemon. Whereas in previous restricted formats like 2016 and 2019, almost the entire team built around a would be built around restricted Pokemon, because you have 2 of them. They're just so strong, right? And so Palkia makes a lot of sense to me in a metagame like this, because it does hit most of the Pokemon in the format for really good damage. Now, it doesn't necessarily match up, like, incredibly well into certain restricted Pokemon. It does wall Kyogre, which I think is really valuable, considering Kyogre is one of the most common restricted Pokemon, but obviously it's not, it doesn't match up super well into Xerneas. However, that being said, Palkia is really good into a lot of the non-restricted Pokemon like Landorus, Incarnate, Landorus, Therian, or Incineroar, for example. And so you just deal massive amounts of damage through the combination of Spatial Rend and Hydro Pump, and it also gets access to Trick Room. This is a pretty standard Palkia set, but it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people running Palkia early on will run Palkia spread like this, or Palkia set like this. One thing to note is that Palkia does not necessarily need Trick Room to thrive, but it certainly can take advantage of it, right? Because it's kind of in that speed tier where some Pokemon will be faster than it, Pokemon like Regieleki, for example. Trick Room is also valuable for a lot of Palkia's partners on this team, as you can see. So you've got Palkia here, and you've got a lot of really strong support. And this team has a lot of cool components to it, so I kind of want to just talk about all of it. First of all, we see a Choice Scarf Landorus Therian, and what's pretty interesting is that Landorus T is actually not nearly as common in Series 10 as all the other formats we've had. Actually, Landorus Incarnate is more common than Landorus T, but we can dive into usage stats in a little bit. But this Landorus T set's really interesting, right? It actually doesn't even have Earthquake, it's carrying Bulldoze here and Earth Power. So Earth Power is really valuable into Pokemon that are typically defensive, but not specially defensive. Stakataka, for example, which this team actually also has, is one in which, you know, is very, very strong defensively, but not very strong from the special defensive side. And so Landorus T can take advantage of that. It also has Bulldoze, which is really cool. Now, note that this Palkia is pressure, it's not telepathy, but of course Bulldoze is really valuable, especially when you're next to the Zapdos, for example, and with that Choice Scarf, you can just drop your opponent's speed immediately, and then Zapdos can potentially outspeed. That's really valuable into, yeah, Pokemon that just outspeed Zapdos typically, for example. And Landorus T is also obviously just a really good counter to Regieleki specifically. Regieleki basically just can't touch this thing, especially in a non-Dynamax format. And so, yeah, Earth Power and Bulldoze are both really interesting techs here. The next thing here is the Zapdos with Rocky Helmet. Rocky Helmet is really cool, and it is an item that we used to see in VGC back in like 2014, 2015 during the Mega Kangaskhan era. Now, obviously, Mega Kangaskhan no longer exists, but Urshifu is actually a thing now, right? And Water Urshifu is a lot more common in Series 10, at least in the early metagame. And so Rocky Helmet is an item that actually counters the Urshifus really nicely because you can just switch in, and they basically just take so much damage from the Rocky Helmet alone. One thing that's really neat about this Zapdos specifically is that it has Roost as well, right? So we don't know the EV spread here, but let's say you are max speed. Max speed Zapdos always outspeeds max speed Urshifu, and so you can switch in on a Surging Strikes, give all that Rocky Helmet damage, and then just Roost back up to heal up immediately. So I really like the Roost decision here, and I think this is super neat. Zapdos is also running Hurricane here, and, you know, it's a little bit unreliable in terms of accuracy, but it is just by far Zapdos' strongest, you know, special flying type attack, so it makes a lot of sense to me here. And then Thunderbolt and Protector standard. Next Pokemon is Amoonguss here, and the Amoonguss actually has some neat tricks as well. Koba is pretty standard. You know, we would see items like Koba, Aka, Focus Sash. Rocky Helmet on Amoonguss was actually really common back in the day to beat Kangaskhan as well. But two things to call out here are the Pollen Puff and the Grass Knot. So this Amoonguss actually doesn't have Protect, which I think is pretty interesting. Pollen Puff is a move that I feel like haven't seen players fully optimize and use, but it's really cool on this team because this team already is pretty bulky, especially with the Zapdos, the Dual Intimidate. Palkia is a pretty bulky restricted mon, Stakataka is bulky as well. Pollen Puff is really nice to just potentially heal these Pokemon up. And then Grass Knot is a move that you see more often in restricted formats just because it does more damage to the heavier restricted Pokemon, especially things like Kyogre or potentially Groudon, for example. And so, yeah, you're going to see that more often than something like Giga Drain or Energy Ball. Finally, to round out the team, you've got Classic Assault Vest Incineroar, nothing too crazy here. One thing to note, though, is that Incineroar is actually a really good offensive tool in Series 10, specifically to counter Calyrex Shadow Rider. Calyrex, especially, you know, without being able to Dynamax, just falls very easily to Dark-type damage, and so Incineroar can be used a little bit more offensively. Maybe you would invest a little bit in attack investment, for example, and you can utilize it to really have a good matchup against Calyrex. Now, Calyrex is still a really strong Pokemon, and typically Calyrex teams will have ways to beat the Incineroar, for example. So it's not like Incineroar hard counters Calyrex, because Calyrex teams will typically have ways to beat the Incineroar, but it's still a really cool option, and Calyrex, you know, struggles against it, especially with the Assault Vest on Incineroar. Like, you can switch on Calyrex super easily. And so you can see that in Series 10, players can, you know, use certain Pokemon, tech in certain moves to beat specific restricted Pokemon, right? So AV Incineroar, Darkest Lariat, great against Calyrex. And finally, the Stakataka. This is such a good answer, especially into Xerneas, which, as I mentioned earlier, is making a comeback in the format. So this Stakataka has safety goggles. That's really valuable because so many Xerneas teams will typically run Amoonguss or Volcarona for redirection support. You might also see other redirection users like Clefairy, for example, or even something like Togekiss. And guess what? Stakataka hits all of those other than Amoonguss for super effective damage, but with safety goggles, you can completely ignore Amoonguss. Rock Slide, Gyro Ball, Trick Room, all pretty standard attacks here. And then you've got the Wide Guard as well, which is really valuable in a format with so many Pokemon with spread damage, right? Xerneas, Kyogre, Groudon, both Calyrex forms, for example. And so Wide Guard's always just nice as insurance, especially because some Pokemon just rely so heavily on their spread type damage. Something like Kyogre, for example, often will run like Water Spout, Origin Pulse, Ice Beam, and Protect. So it's like the stack attack could actually wall some Kyogres if they don't run like a Scald or a Hydro Pump, for example. And so I love the safety goggles plus the Gyro Ball combo here, right? Because it's like if you're going up against Xerneas, if they lead Volcarona Xerneas, Incineroar Xerneas, the Amoonguss plus Xerneas, the stack attack actually can match up pretty well into all of them. And so, yeah, I think this is, something you're going to see more often as well. Both safety goggles and Rocky Helmet, I think, are just really solid items, especially early on in the format. And at the end of the day, you can see that it's not just Palkia that needs to do damage on this team, right? Like Landorus can set its teammates up for success here. Can even potentially pick up some big knockouts, Rock Slide onto Volcarona, for example. Zapdos is just really bulky and it's going to be difficult to take care of, especially when you have Roost and the Pollen Puff. And then Stack Attack is a Pokemon that can snowball very quickly, especially when you consider Beast Boost as well. And Incineroar here is a little bit more offensive as it has U-Turn, Flare Blitz, and Darkest Lariat, and has the Assault Vest instead. And so this team is generally just relatively bulky, difficult to KO, a lot of healing with Regenerator, Roost, and Pollen Puff. And like I said, Palkia is just a strong option into a lot of the non-restricted Pokemon, can match up well into them, can set up Trick Room for its teammates, and also Spatial Rend and Hydro Pump are just really strong attacks, right? Especially when you combine Palkia's item and the same type attack bonus. So really, really cool to see Palkia win this entire event, and I was really surprised to see some of the sets here, but I think, yeah, a lot of these make really a lot of sense to me, and they're generally just super strong options. So that's going to be it for the winning Palkia team. So like I mentioned, I wanted to kind of take a look at just like the top 8 teams, especially because there's a fair amount of diversity, right? You've got Palkia, Calyrex, Shadow Rider, Zacian, Kyogre, and Xerneas. And so the top 8 really give a good picture of all the restricted Pokemon that you might see. So diving into the next team here, we've got Calyrex Shadow Rider stuff. So Calyrex Shadow Rider is very similar to how you may have seen it in Series 8, which is, players often do run Substitute. You're not going to see like Mudshot as frequently. Substitute is just so strong on this, especially because of how fast Calyrex already is. So some other cool things about this team, first of all, Whimsicott. Whimsicott and Calyrex was a really popular pairing previously, and that continues to be the case. Cottonspore here is a really interesting option that we don't see used very frequently, but I think makes a lot of sense in the context of this team. And the rest of the Pokemon here are pretty standard. You've got classic AV Rillaboom, Citrus Berry on the Incineroar. There is Taunt here, which you'll note is, always just a good option on Incineroar. I feel like we actually saw a lot of players use Taunt towards like the middle, towards end of Series 9, so nothing too surprising here. And then this is one trend I want to talk about. Urshifu, Water is really common in this format, but players are moving away from throwing a Focus Sash on it. Now, more often than not, you'll see items like Mystic Water, Life Orb, Choice Scarf, or Choice Band. And so, yeah, Sash just isn't as necessary on Urshifu anywhere, and Mystic Water just greatly increases your damage output. And so that's kind of one metagame development where things have shifted a little bit going into this format. And then finally, you've got Now-Ego. Now-Ego is really, really smart because it also is one of those Pokemon, once again, following the trend of like a Poison or a Steel type, that matches up really, really well into Xerneas and Xerneas' common partners, right? This Now-Ego will destroy any potential Volcaronas with Meteor Beam. You get a boost, you get the KO, you get Beast Boost, and suddenly you're at +2 special attack. And Now-Ego also walls Xerneas really, really well. And Now-Ego is also just good into, other Pokemon that Xerneas teams would typically have, like Incineroar, for example. And so, yeah, Xerneas is a really big threat in this format, and you can see already how players are starting to counter it. So, this is often just kind of set up Tailwind. You've got dual Taunt here to deny potential Trick Rooms. If Trick Room goes up against this team, it's going to be really tough, right? You're going to have to basically protect Calyrex, Psycho, and Intimidate and go from there. So this team relies on ideally outspeeding your opponent, and Calyrex Shadow Rider is a Pokemon that can just snowball the game very, very quickly. So, yeah, that is going to be it for the runner-up team here. And, one thing in this, like, finals matchup is that Palkia, like, doesn't take super effective damage from anything, bar, like, the Whimsicott. And, if you can, eliminate Whimsicott plus the combination of, like, Trick Room here, even though there's dual Taunt here, like, if you actually get Trick Room up, it's really difficult to win if you're the Calyrex Shadow Rider player here. So, yeah. Calyrex Shadow Rider continues to be a really dominant force, as you can see. And Nosh here also used the Calyrex Shadow Rider team. Once again, Substitute. Once again, Whimsicott. But this Whimsicott has Protect Encore and is the more common Focus Sash variant. And as you can see, like, Whimsicott just has so much utility in this format. And so, yeah, you just get so many different cool attacks. And Encore here is really nice, especially into Trick Room teams, because so few people, like, respect Encore these days, I think. And so, classic Mystic Water, Urshifu once again. A bunch of other interesting things on this team, including the Psychic Seed, Tapu Lele, and the AV Incineroar, the Entei. The Entei here is actually really offensive as well, right? Instead of like Snarl, which you would typically see on it, it actually has Stomping Tantrum and Stone Edge. And so Entei is pretty nice because it does wall a fair amount of Pokemon, especially with the Assault Vest. It doesn't completely wall Xerneas if Xerneas gets set up, but at the same time, like even if Xerneas gets set up, it's not like one-shotting Entei, and Entei can retaliate back with some good physical damage. And Entei's main, viable kind of what makes it really viable in the format, one is that it's a good fire type with good speed, but two, it also has inner focus, so you don't have to worry about getting flinched. With so many fake outers in the format, including Incineroar and Rillaboom, that's going to be really valuable. And then finally, there's Citrus Ditto, which is really, really cool. I think when I see Ditto, I normally expect Choice Scarf, but Ditto is a Pokemon that typically has a really good impact, especially in the restricted formats, because you can copy opposing restricted Pokemon, which is really, really valuable. And so Citrus is just helpful in allowing you to survive for a little bit longer. So I think, Whimsicott, Calyrex is a really common duo. Urshifu seems to be very common in it as well, because this counters Incineroar, which otherwise gives Calyrex a lot of trouble. And then Psychic Terrain from something like a Lele or a Indeedee makes a lot of sense. And the Lele here has Shadow Ball, which is really nice because that actually helps out against opposing Calyrex Shadow Riders, right? You can potentially just like Tailwind and Shadow Ball. And so you're going to see more players, I think, Tekken, Ghost, or Dark type attacks specifically to help out against Calyrex. If it's like, it's not like Shadow Ball would be that common on Lele back in the day, but now it makes a lot of sense, especially in a format like this. So, yep. It's going to be it for Inosh's team. Inosh, by the way, is really, I think, one of the best players ever in the history of the game, so it's really cool to see him competing again. We used to play against each other a lot. He got, second at the 2013 U.S. National Championships, top 8 at Worlds that year, and then got top 8 at Worlds in 2011 in the seniors division as well. So he's always been, I think, one of the kind of best team builders and players, and so it's really cool to see him make a comeback. So, looking at the 4th place team, this is, I think, one of the more standard kind of Zacian compositions, and if there is like a dominant Zacian team comp in the beginning of the format, it is just this, right? You have the 4 most common, like, kind of non-restricted Pokemon like Incin, Alecki, Rillaboom, and Urshifu, and then Landorus I am glad we finally get to see a team with this, because this Pokemon has also really increased in popularity in in the format. It's going to be one of the most common non-restricted Pokemon, and the main reason is because it outspeeds a lot of things, including Xerneas, for example, and can one-shot a lot of Pokemon. Landorus I hasn't been that good throughout, Sword and Shield, partially because of Dynamax. It's a Pokemon that doesn't want to Dynamax because of its ability, sheer force, but as a result, Landorus I really struggled because there were so many Pokemon when Dynamax would just easily beat it and would wall Landorus, and Landorus is relatively frail, so it definitely thrives a little bit more in a non-Dynamax format. All of these sets are pretty standard, other than the drum beating here, which I think is pretty cool on Rillaboom. But, you've got the safety goggles on Incineroar. This is just valuable in general, especially into Mungus and Volcarona once again. You've got AV on the Rillaboom, the classic Mystic Water Urshifu. With Zacians, we saw Substitute a lot back in Series 8. That continues to be the case, and that makes sense given how fast Zacian is. And Substitutes can help just in general, especially if you have a good lead matchup ready. And with dual Fake Out, you can just like Fake Out Sub potentially. Regieleki, I think one common trend you're going to see in this format is instead of running Magnet, a lot of players now are opting for the Focus Sash on Alecki rather than something like Urshifu, which makes a lot of sense. And then finally, Life Orb Landorus I. You're typically going to see Earth Power Sludge Bomb and then one of Stone Edge or Substitute here. So yeah, I think if you're looking for a strong Zacian team in the beginning of the format, like this has everything, right? It's just some of the strongest Pokemon thrown together. These are all just some of the best non-restricted Pokemon, and Zacian can just match up well against most Pokemon, right? So it's all about positioning, cycling, and potential Fake Outs. Alecki can drop opposing speeds with Electro Web, and then you just get so much damage from Pokemon like Urshifu and Landorus I as well. So it's cool because, you can lead Alecki, Urshifu, Alecki, Landorus, and then use Zacian potentially for cleanup in the end game. So that's going to round out the top 4 teams, and yeah, let's look at the next 4. So, it's pretty cool. We've already seen 3 different restricted Pokemon in the top 4, and then Marcus's team at 5th place is also yet another restricted Pokemon, and this team is really cool for a couple of reasons. Yeah, we actually just used Naganadel on Road to Rank, which is pretty cool. Like, I had kind of forgotten about this Pokemon. Turns out it actually was pretty good in Series 9, but I think this is also a really solid Pokemon in Series 10, and once again, it is a strong Poison type. You're going to see more Poison and Steel types in general general in this format because of how they match up against Xerneas. And Naganadel, of course, is very speedy, can outspeed Xerneas with that safety goggle. Similar idea to some of the Pokemon we saw earlier. Ignore Rage Powders from Volcarona, Amoonguss, and just get a Sludge Bomb off. Naganadel also has really good coverage and outspeeds just most of the Pokemon in the format, right? And so this is just a really cool set. And yeah, not something I would expect to be, popular early on, but this is like good team building, right? You can see how Xerneas otherwise would probably have a really good matchup into this team because nothing resists Fairy. But Naganadel combined with this Tornadus, which can Taunt, which can Tailwind, then you're able to substantially increase your damage output into Xerneas. And the other thing here is that the team is Tsareena. Tsareena is going to be something you're going to see more frequently in this format as well because of its ability, Queenly Majesty, which allows you to prevent like priority fake outs, right? So one thing you can do is lead Naganadel and Tornadus, and if your opponent leads like Incineroar or Xerneas, you can just switch Tornadus out into Tsareena and just Sludge Bomb immediately into Xerneas. And so that ability to switch in Tsareena at any given point, preventing fake out, is really important, especially into a team like this, which wants to set up Tailwind, which wants to deny Xerneas setup. And this is just classic Kyogre with Mystic Water. Typically, you want to just get speed control, whether it be Tailwind, whether it be Icy Wind, or Electro Whip from Regieleki. Drop your opponent's speed and just maximize your damage output from Kyogre. Tsareena, most Tsareenas in this format are going to run the Assault Vest just because so many of the best restricted Pokemon are special attackers, and so this allows Tsareena to match up pretty well into them. And then finally, just classic Citrus Berry Incineroar. The Regieleki here is a little bit more offensive. The Focus Sash is already committed on the Tornadus, and so it's running Life Orb. And Life Orb plus Thunder is not to be scoffed at, right? That damage output's really good, and we didn't really see Thunder on Aleki in the previous formats because Rain wasn't that common. But with this team, since Kyogre is coming out in pretty much every game, that guarantees you have the Rain up, which means Aleki can do substantially more damage. Like, a Thunder with Life Orb, it does a lot more than a Thunderbolt with Magnet from Aleki, right? And so that can just give you, like, the extra burst of damage that you need. I would say that for Kyogre Rain teams, like Tornadus, Kyogre, Tsareena, Incin is maybe, like, the most common core. Aleki is pretty frequently seen on it. And then Naganadel here is specifically, like, the most interesting tech to me. So that is really, really neat here. And once again, kind of speaks to the trend of players using Pokemon to counter specific restricteds. We've been doing so much talking about Xerneas, so it's about time we can actually finally look at a Xerneas team here. So once again, like, the cool thing I love about this tournament is like how different actually the top 8 teams are. Like, yeah, you have some restricted, repeat restricteds, right? 2 Zacians, 2 Calyrex-S, 2 Palkias. But at the end of the day, these teams are quite different from each other. So moving on into Xerneas team here, we've already seen a bunch of trends that we've talked about, like the Aleki, for example, with Focus Sash, the Life Orb Urshifu. So this is Dark Urshifu, which, we haven't seen up until now. But Dark Urshifu with that Wicked Blow, very, very nice into Calyrex Shadow Rider. Clear Smog Amoonguss here. And this is more of a standard Amoonguss set, but, Clear Smog is a really good move, especially in a restricted format, because so many Pokemon rely on, like, getting, or not rely on, but often really like getting boosts, right? Whether it be a Xerneas. Clear Smog's Amoonguss was used back in the day to counter Xerneas specifically, but also potentially helpful into Pokemon that get boosts like Calyrex Shadow Rider if they get, a single boost off its ability, for example. And so, yeah, you've got Throat Chop here on the Incineroar. That is more common in the restricted formats as well, but otherwise standard set. The Choice Scarf Entei here, which is really neat. And so with Choice Scarf Entei, you can just potentially outspeed things, obviously, before they attack, and potentially one-shot things. And as you can see, the Scarf Entei here has Crunch. So there's a lot of anti-Calyrex Shadow Rider stuff here between the Crunch, the the Throat Chop, and the Urshifu. And with Sucker Punch and Life Orb, like, if the Calyrex doesn't go for a if it just goes for an attack and greeds it, like, Urshifu can obviously just KO, and so that damage output is just really nice. And once again, you're not running the Sash here because you already have Sash committed on the Regieleki. And almost all Xerneas sets are going to run Dazzling, Moonblast, Geomancy, and Protect. Sometimes you'll see players, like, give up one of these 2 attacks for a coverage move, but this is just the standard Xerneas set. It's always been the standard Xerneas set. And unfortunately, we can't see the EV spreads, but you do have a lot of room to potentially play with your EV spreads, and that leaves a lot of room for creativity with Xerneas. Some players like no special attack, a ton of bulk, no speed investment. Other players like to just run max special attack and max speed, and so you do have a lot of room. Like, even though Xerneas will typically have these moves, the EV spread makes all the difference often in a lot of matchups. So yeah, this Xerneas set team doesn't have Volcarona, but like I said, you're almost always going to see Incineroar Xerneas plus a redirection user for any Xerneas team in this format. So moving on to the final two teams, we're going to take a look at them, look at some usage stats, and then just go over some other, teams with interesting Pokemon that I think are really cool. This was used by Binjia Wang, who has really been one of my favorite players in Sword and Shield. He's been a phenomenal player. He got second at the first regional championships in Dallas. And we've actually featured so many of his teams on Road to Ranked. I think that he is just a really, really great talent in the game, and I expect him to be, like one of the heavy favorites to contend at major tournaments once they return in person. And so he actually ended up using Palkia as well, but it's a slightly different take on Palkia. As you can see, same stuff here with the Lustrous Orb and the same set as the winning Palkia, but you've got Choice Band Landers, and this Palkia does have Telepathy, right? And so you can lead Landers T plus Palkia and just go for Earthquake. Like this Landers is designed to do a little bit more damage than the Landers on the winning team. But there are a bunch of similar Pokemon, obviously, with the Stakataka as well. And yeah, some of the items here are just really interesting, and the sets, right? You've got Bulldoze and Life Orb on the Entei, and so this allows you to lead Entei Palkia or Landers Palkia. You can Bulldoze and then let Palkia outspeed things, and into really fast things, right? Palkia can just Trick Room. You can lead like Indeedee Palkia, Indeedee Stakataka, and just Trick Room, for example. And so this is a little bit more offensive. Extreme Speed plus Life Orb often just gives you a burst of damage that a lot of players don't expect, so that's really cool as well. So two Pokemon that can take advantage of the Telepathy here. The Brutal Swing specifically is really nice into Calyrex Shadow Rider once again, as well as the Shadow Ball on Indeedee. So once again, players are teching in specific moves to beat specific restricted Pokemon, and you're going to see that primarily for Calyrex, I think, and Xerneas, because their weaknesses are really, really exposable, and so you can really take advantage of that. EV Rillaboom here is very, very standard. Note the U-turn here. U-turn and switching in general is really valuable in a format like this where, games go on for a little bit longer, and so you can pivot out and have more defensive switches. And finally, the Stakataka here is really interesting. So instead of Wide Guard, there's Substitute, and instead of Safety Goggles, there's Wide Herb. Now, Wide Herb is really nice because it resets the Intimidate drop, and so what this helps out against is, let's say your opponent leads like Incineroar plus Xerneas, Wide Herb will get rid of that Intimidate boost, and what you can do is actually potentially just switch in Indeedee turn 1 to negate their Fake Out, as Stakataka just goes for a Gyro Ball or Trick Room onto the Xerneas, for example. Substitute's also really nice because often, Stakataka matches up really well offensively into certain Pokemon. If your opponent leads like Incin's Xerneas or Volcarona Xerneas, they're often going to, be tempted to protect the Xerneas and then maybe switch out the Incin or the Volcarona. So you can get a big substitute off there, and what's really nice is, the Wide Herb gets rid of the initial Intimidate, and once you substitute, it's going to be tough to decrease the Stakataka's attack even further. And so I think this is a really, really cool set as well. And in general, Stakataka I think is just a very strong Pokemon in this format, but it's cool to see how different players are approaching the builds. So the really cool things I like about this team are the Stakataka set, the EQ Brutal Swing combo with the Bandlanders, the Bulldoze specifically, and Life Orb with Palkia and Telepathy, and then the Shadow Ball Focus Sash Indeedee. We've seen that Sash Indeedee plus a Trick Room user, it's just so hard to actually deny Trick Room when you have that combination, because even if you basically, it's very difficult to knock out the Trick Room user as well as the Indeedee, right? You'd have to basically use two spread attacks, and it's really hard to have two Pokemon that can hit, both Indeedee and the Trick Room user and pick up a double KO immediately. So yeah, this is just one of the best ways to help set up Trick Room. And finally, let's look at the 8th place team. This is just kind of another standard Zacian team. It actually might be the exact same one. Yeah, actually, as the one that got, fourth, looks like. Yeah, it's the exact same Pokemon. So I think the sets are pretty much identical here, if I remember correctly. But either way, like I said, this is just going to be one of your strongest team compositions running around in the format right now. And I think, yeah, if you're looking for something that's probably, just little, I think everything here is relatively intuitive. So if you're looking for something that's really strong and can be, I wouldn't say easily piloted, because I think a format like this is generally just pretty hard. But if you're looking for something that's just really strong from day one, I think, yeah, this is kind of like a big 6 composition that you can play towards. So yeah, that's going to round it for the top 8 teams. Let's quickly look at the usage stats and then look at some other interesting sets in Pokemon and teams from the rest of the tournament. Moving on to the usage statistics, what I did was basically, I took all the teams and then aggregated the number of times a Pokemon appeared, and I split it into restricted Pokemon and non-restricted Pokemon. So let's start off with restricted Pokemon. We already saw, within the top 4, we talked about Zacian, Calyrex, Kyogre, Xerneas. Palkia is really interesting because in the top 32, only 2 players, used Palkia, but both of those made it to the top 8, and obviously Palkia won the event. So this is really cool to me because it's like Palkia is not very meta right now, but it's clearly has a role in the metagame. And like, it's not like, once again, Palkia is carrying the entire team. It is a very critical component, but the Palkia teams we've seen also have some really smart team building, right? Whether it be the way the stack attackers are composed or the ways that they have to beat Xerneas, for example. And so it's really cool to me that even though Palkia only had 2 appearances here and was one of the least common restricted Pokemon, it ended up doing so well in the event. So Zacian, Calyrex, Kyogre, Xerneas, these are all Pokemon I think we kind of expected to be on top at the start of the format. Eternatus here is really interesting. So I want to take a look at some Eternatus teams in just a little bit. And, Eternatus was something that was very irrelevant for the most part in Series 8, especially at a high level. It just, couldn't really hang with the top Pokemon. But it is definitely a lot more viable in this format because this format's, a little bit bulkier and games go on for a little bit longer. And once again, Eternatus also just has really good coverage in terms of its attacks, right? So it's able to hit for super effective damage into a lot of the common Pokemon in the format. So this is really cool to see. There's also a Reshiram team, which we'll take a look at in just a little bit, and then 1 Calyrex-Ice. Interestingly enough, there were no Groudon, Yveltal, Dialga, or Kyurem, which were all Pokemon I think are still going to be really good in this metagame. So, this tournament just didn't favor it, but I've seen plenty of strong Groudon teams running around. So, it's not like, oh, you look at the top 32, you're like, oh, there were no Groudon or Yveltal, these Pokemon are bad. It just so happens that for this tournament, the way the early meta shaped up for this event, these Pokemon just weren't able to make the top 32. But these are all top restricted Pokemon that I expected, see do very well in the format as well. So, looking at the non-restricted Pokemon here on the right side, I think the top 4 most people could have predicted: Incin, Rillaboom, Aleki, Urshifu. These were the top Pokemon in previous formats in this year, and they continue to be super, super good. One thing that's interesting here is how many people use Incineroar, right? 32 people were in the top cut, and 26 out of the 32, that's over a 75% rate, had an Incineroar. But Incineroar has just been a staple in every format it's existed in, right? And it's even better now because of Calyrex Shadow Rider being so common. This actually matches up really well into Calyrex specifically, and Rillaboom matches up well into Kyogre, Aleki matches up well into Kyogre, Urshifu's just a good staple in the format, and matches up well into the Incineroar and the Landorus Eye. And so the top 4 here are not surprising at all, but there are some really interesting ones, and I've actually bolded them for you here. So we already talked about Landorus Eye earlier. This is just a really solid Pokemon into a lot of the restricted Pokemon, and also outspeeds a lot of the non-restricted Pokemon, notably outspeeds both Volcarona and Xerneas. You can Sludge Bomb and Stone Edge them. And so yeah, this is going to be a very early meta staple because of the amount of damage that it can dish out. We'll take a look at a sample Volcarona set in just a little bit, but I already talked about this a lot. You're going to see it so commonly with Xerneas because it just covers for the biggest counters to Xerneas, like Steel types, and also can redirect damage away, and also matches up really well into Zacian. Entei also, we've seen a couple of sets already, but that's also going to be really nice into Zacian. We saw Choice Scarf Entei earlier, that can just get Scarf Sacred Fire into Zacian. We've seen Life Orb Entei, AV Entei, so bunch of different ways that people are running Entei, and even though there were only 5 in the top 32, a lot of those made the top 8, right? So that shows me that this is actually a really good offensive Pokemon in this format. Tsareena we already talked about a little bit earlier, but you're going to typically see on those rain teams or teams that just really don't want you to click Fake Out into it. And then Mienshao here is really interesting. So Mienshao a little bit more common in this format because it's one of the faster Fake Out users. You're often going to see an item like Focus Sash on it, and it gets access to really good utility, right? You get Feint, you get Wide Guard, you get Ally Switch, can close combat as well. And so yeah, Mienshao is just a faster Fake Out user, and that's really valuable in a format where you can't Dynamax, right? Whereas in previous formats, it's really easy to counter Mienshao because you can just max on it, and it basically makes the Fake Out super, super useless. But in this format, the Mienshao can actually outspeed your common Fake Out users in Incineroar, Rillaboom, and Fake Out them before they get an attack off. One thing that's interesting here is that Landorus T's usage rate has fallen off a cliff, right? This was a top 1, maybe top 1 Pokemon, if not top 3, in Series 9, Series 7, for example. Was very common in Series 8 as well, but is definitely fallen off substantially because without being able to Dynamax, it's definitely a little bit weaker. Once again, really interesting, the 2 Palkia teams that we featured in the winning team and the top 8 team both had Landorus T, and so that's 2 of the 4 right there. Talked about Stack Attacka. Suicune here is interesting. It's a bulkier, non-restricted Pokemon. Gets access to good utility like Tailwind and Icy Wind and Snarl. And also, it's just pretty difficult to KO and can stay on the field for a long time. And so, once again, stronger in a format like this where you can't just burst it with the max move immediately. And then finally, Ditto and Shedinja are always two Pokemon that seem to come out during the restricted years. Shedinja is like a really funny kind of trolly Pokemon, but it is actually very legitimate, and its biggest asset is its ability, obviously, and it works a lot better in a restricted format where, one, there's very little sand or hail, for example, so you don't have to deal with that, and two, Shedinja actually can just wall some restricted Pokemon, right? We looked at Kyogre, we looked at Palkia, we looked at Xerneas. None of those actually have a way to hit Shedinja for super effective damage. So it's still a really tough Pokemon to execute, in my opinion, but we did see Shedinja be a pretty interesting option, especially in VGC 2019. And so I think this is a really hard Pokemon to use, to be honest, and I wouldn't recommend it if you're just starting out, but it definitely can work at a high level. And if you position correctly with it, it can just win you the game, right? If you're you can just checkmate your opponent essentially if you knock out like the Incineroar or whatever Pokemon they have to hit this for super effective damage. And then Ditto, we talked about earlier. We saw it on Inoshi's team, but the value in this is being able to just transform immediately into a restricted Pokemon and can just give you a second restricted Pokemon, which is really cool. So final group of Pokemon here, we looked at Naganadel, Aegislash, and Scizor also made an appearance, and so once again, you're just seeing more people run like, I know this Rillaboom should be, the spelling is incorrect, so it actually should be one higher up here, 20, not 19, but yeah, like you're seeing more players use strong steel types or poison types to specifically counter Xerneas, and so to continue that trend, both Aegislash and Scizor here obviously can match up pretty well into the Xerneas, so yeah. That's going to be it for the usage stats. Let's quickly take a look at some of the more interesting teams like the Eternatus, the Reshiram, and then some of these non-restricted Pokemon. I kind of want to look at, what sets players are running. So, yeah. We talked about Mienshao earlier, so let's quickly take a look at this team. This is the highest ranking team with Mienshao, and it has Ditto, and no surprise, you've got the Choice Scarf on the Ditto here. That's going to be, it's probably the most common item on Ditto. And then with Mienshao here, Fake Out, Close Combat, and Wide Guard. A knockoff is actually pretty sweet as well, especially with the Focus Sash. It allows you to actually hit Calyrex Shadow Rider for super effective, and it also just remove items in general. And for example, this could actually work against Xerneas if you just knock off their power before they get the Geomancy off. That can be really sweet. So you lead Fake Out plus, like, dual Fake Out and then use Fake Out from one of Incineroar, Rillaboom, and then knock off onto Xerneas potentially. So generally just a good utility move. This Alecki does have the Magnet rather than Focus Sash, so it's not like Magnet's completely fallen off, but as you've seen from the previous Alecki, some players are opting for that Focus Sash. This team has a lot of cool things that I want to talk about, including Eternatus, Suicune, and Volcarona. So a lot of players now are running Meteor Beam on Eternatus, and we actually used Power Meteor Beam in Series 8, which is pretty cool to see, but yeah, this makes more sense to me because it's even more difficult to KO Eternatus in a non-Dynamax format. This team also has a lot of good support, right? You've got the Intimidate from the Incineroar, the Snarl from the Suicune, and so it's generally pretty difficult to just easily KO Eternatus, but I really like some components of this team, including the Grass Knot on the Tapu Koko with the Focus Sash, so this is clearly not like meant to be a huge damage dealer unless like Grass Knot's helpful into like Groudon or Kyogre, for example, but otherwise you can control the speed, Electro Web to help Eternatus out, and also Volt Switch for pivoting, basically. Volt Switch into an Incineroar or a Suicune. The Volcarona set here is really cool, right? It's actually a Quiver Dance set, and we used to see Quiver Dance Volcarona a lot back in the day. It's not as common nowadays because, yeah, especially, throughout the last couple formats, especially with like Landorus T being so common and Thunderous T with Max Airstream, you kind of just get one shot. But now you don't have to worry as much about that kind of burst damage, right? Incineroar can intimidate a lot of Pokemon that threaten Volcarona. If you just avoid the rock type damage with a Citrus Berry, you actually survive for a while. And Volcarona, once again, can just match up really well into Zacian. So something like Instant Volcarona, just fake out Quiver Dance. Once you get a boost, Zacian, definitely struggles even more against Volcarona because he has to worry about just getting one hit KO'd by Flamethrower. So this is generally like a slower, bulkier team. You've got the leftovers on the Suicune, the Tailwind as well, and Eternatus here just does a lot of damage, right? Between Rock, Poison, and Dragon, like you have really good coverage. The Meteor Beam often is just going to allow you to get a huge burst amount of damage off and give you a boost, and at +1, Eternatus just does so much to everything. So yeah, this is one way that players are running Eternatus right now, but glad to also feature the Suicune and the Volcarona there because those are two Pokemon that we talked a little bit about earlier. So once again, you can see the classic Zacian core that we talked about. I mean, it's the same 6 Pokemon, right? And so many players are just running Zacian that way right now. So nothing too surprising there. This team has the Volcarona and the Xerneas, so I quickly want to take a look at here. It is indeed the Rage Powder, so yep, designed to just set up the Geomancy here. AV Galarian Moltres is really cool to see here. That's going to be an excellent counter into the Calyrex Shadow Riders. And then Life Orb Stack Attack here designed to do a little bit more damage. It also has Gastrodon on the team, which is really neat because obviously it can redirect those potential water type attacks away. Gastrodon alone is a really nice counter into the Kyogre teams as well, right? If you can actually eliminate Tsareena, which is often on those Kyogre teams, it's actually going to be really difficult to deal with the Gastrodon because most of the Kyogre teams rely on Kyogre, Regieleki, and Urshifu to deal their damage. And so the Rindo here helps against Tsareena as well, and this is kind of like a nice way to counter some of the rain teams that you see. Because if you don't have Gastrodon on this team, like Tailwind plus Water Spout can really just sweep through everything here. And so Volcarona here, interestingly enough, is also running that safety goggles, which helps out against opposing Amoonguses, for example, so they can't spore you. And more importantly, not spore, sorry, they can't redirect attacks away from the Volcarona, which is also pretty nice. But this is interesting because it's got Rage Powder as well as Quiver Dance, and so, you know, in the right setup, in the right matchup, you can actually potentially set up on your opponent, especially into like a Zacian team, for example, right? So, yeah. So that's going to be it for the Volk here. This team has Shedinja, so I want to go over Shedinja, Reshiram, and yeah. So classic Kyogre, classic Tsareena here, and the Tornadus instead of Focus Sash on this one, though, we've got the Wakamberry, which is really valuable into Luckies, and Protect, so basically you can Protect turn 1 on a Fake Out and then just Tailwind turn 2. Roar, Safety Goggles, Incineroar here. That was something we saw back in the day, and that's a nice counter into Amoonguss Xerneas, Volcarona Xerneas. Choice Band, Urshifu here, really valuable specifically with Kyogre. You get Tailwind, you get Rain, Choice Band, Surging Strikes. It just does so much damage. And then finally, Shedinja here. This has Ally Switch, and I honestly think this is probably one of the best moves to run on Shedinja just because it adds so much more variability to the Pokemon. So these moves all make sense. It's just offensive, right? It sticks on the field and just difficult to KO. Obviously, if you don't have the super effective damage to break through Wonder Guard, Sash is obviously the item of choice here, but Ally Switch is just so difficult because it's like so many players are like, okay, I have to deal with Shedinja. How do I beat it? Well, let me use super effective damage. And often that super effective damage is just going to be really weak into all some of the other Pokemon. Flying is actually pretty valuable here, but something like Ghost or Dark just doesn't do that much into the rest of the team. So yeah, this is how players are running Shedinja. I've seen Shedinja on the Rain team specifically as well, so keep that in mind. And now we're finally going to take a look at the Reshiram team. So I'm glad to look at this just because, one, Reshiram's just a really cool Pokemon, and this set features Shadow Ball, Earth Power, Blue Flare, and Draco Meteor with the Assault Vest, so it's just designed to stay on the field for a long time. It has incredible coverage, right? 4 different types of offensive attacks here and can easily pick up one-hit KOs onto a lot of common Pokemon. Shadow Ball, once again, really valuable into Calyrex Shadow Rider. Classic Sashaleki, Rillaboom, and Incin again. And finally, I think 2 interesting components of the team. First of all, you have Choice Scarf Urshifu here. This Scarf Urshifu will allow you to outspeed a lot of things that normally wouldn't expect you to outspeed, and you can potentially just pick up a KO onto them with something like Surging Strikes, especially something like Landorus Incarnate, for example, right? You can just one-shot them immediately. Lando Eye is actually pretty good into Reshiram because of super effective Earth Powers, and so yeah, Urshifu is really sweet here. And then finally, Aegislash with the Power Anklet and the Gyro Ball, as well as Wide Guard and Shadow Sneak. And so this is really cool. Aegislash is making a comeback for sure. It struggled a lot, obviously, this year because in a Dynamax format, it's just one of the worst, maybe the worst, like, non-restricted Pokemon in Dynamax because of the way Stance Change works. And so, yeah, it makes sense that it's making a comeback now. And instead of, like, the Shadow Ball Flash Cannon sets you used to see back in the day, Gyro Ball with the Power Anklet just really maximizes your damage output from Gyro Ball. And once again, this is just really nice into Xerneas. Shadow Sneak actually specifically is really nice into Calyrex Shadow Rider as well for burst damage, and then Wide Guard makes sense for all the spread damage running around. You don't want your Reshiram taking like Precipice Blades from Groudon, for example, and so that helps. And yes, Groudon didn't make the top 32 here, but a lot of players are still running it. So yeah, I think that is almost it for all the teams I wanted to cover. I wanted to just quickly take a look at a couple of the other Eternatus teams, and so like, this is also the same Power Meteor Beam set, but it has Recover over Protect. There's Whirlwind on this Volcarona. A lot of same Pokemon here, actually, as the other Eternatus team with the Suicune as well. But Rocky, Helmet, Landorus T with Rock Tomb. This is what I'm saying, right? Like, this can be really handy as it will just trade a lot of damage onto opposing Urshifus. Rock Tomb is really cool for speed control. You notice the Rock Tomb as well as the Tailwind here. And then finally, this is just a classic Focus Sash Urshifu. So Sash is still a thing on Urshifu. Like I mentioned, it's just not as common as before. So yeah, I think with Eternatus, you're almost always going to see these 3 attacks, and Recover is really cool. I actually didn't know Eternatus got Recover until I saw this team, and so this is like, okay, hey, Eternatus is already pretty difficult to deal with. You throw in Intimidate, you throw in Snarl, you throw in Will-O-Wisp, and it's just even more difficult to deal with Redirection. You get the boost off, and this is just launching +1, you know, super effective Flamethrower, Sludge Bombs across the board, which is really neat. But no signature, you know, attack on Eternatus here. You do have to drop one of them for Recover, and Flamethrower and Sludge Bomb definitely, I think, give you a little bit better coverage across the board, so that makes sense. The only downside of running Meteor Beam is, like, once you use it, if you like use Protect, right, you don't get to use any rock type attacks afterwards. I mean, you can still use Meteor Beam afterwards, but it's obviously just going to be substantially weaker, so you typically don't want to do that. And so, yeah, you can see a lot of Volcaronas down here, and I think I want to take a look at 2 more teams, including this. Another Eternatus team has that Choice Band Scizor, which is really, really cool. Substitute on Landowai, you're going to see Sub or Stone Edge most of the time, but Choice Band Scizor is really neat. Once again, just burst the damage with Bullet Punch into Xerneas. Dual Wing Beat's really cool, and potentially one-shotting Pokemon like Rillaboom or Urshifu, for example. And then we've got Light Clay Grimmsnarl here. I was actually kind of surprised to see so few players run this Grimmsnarl set, just because this has been one of the most common Grimmsnarls, right, in the previous formats. But it makes a lot of sense. Once again, I feel like Eternatus teams are definitely a little bit slower paced and a little bit bulkier. You just want to make sure this Pokemon never faints, basically. And the cool trend here is Darkest Lariat. Once again, this gives you a really good answer into the Calyrex Shadow Rider. So the way to, you know, beat Calyrex Shadow Rider and the trends there continue. And so, yeah, the last team I wanted to take a look at was the Calyrex-Ice team here, because that is the last restricted Pokemon we haven't taken a look at. Once again, Sub on the Landorus, once again, AV Incin, Focus Ashileki, all common trends. This Calyrex actually has White Herb, which is pretty cool, and it's running Trick Room as well. So there's 2 potential Trick Room users. White Herb is just really valuable into Incineroars and Landoruses. You know, there's still a lot of Intimidate in the format, so that's helpful. And it's, instead of the weakness policy set, like Policy in general is just a little bit weaker of an item in the format, which makes sense because you can't Dynamax, and so, you know, it's like you can maybe get the policy off, but then your Pokemon might just faint. And so, yeah, it's just going to be White Herb. And Calyrex, once again, can snowball pretty quickly if you get a KO or 2 with Glacial Lance. But the Dusclops here is running pretty much all standard moves, and Haze is something we saw a little bit of when Dusclops was first popular this year. But this is just really good into Xerneas, right? If you look at this team, there's no Fairy resist, and so it's like Xerneas more often than not will be able to get set up, but you can just lead something like Incin, Dusclops, Fake Out Haze, or even, you know, set up Trick Room. And then, yeah, if you Haze, then Xerneas is just so much weaker. And then classic Choice Specs Tapu Fini here. I think Specs Fini makes a lot of sense in this format. You just get like a burst of damage off immediately with it. It's probably going to be a little bit more difficult to set up with Calm Mind. That being said, I think Calm Mind Fini can work into a lot of the common restricted Pokemon, so it's not a bad set by any means, but I think Specs is also very, very strong here, and often will just give you that burst of damage because I feel like so many players are conditioned to think that Tapu Fini is going to be like setup, for example. So, yeah. So obviously I couldn't cover all of the teams, but I think that pretty much covers all of like the main things that I thought were really, really interesting. You know, we talked about the top 8 teams. As you can see, there were a bunch of different restricted Pokemon that made it. I think it was, what, 8 in total. And so, yeah, you can, you know, check out this link in the description below for details for the rest. And yeah, I didn't expect this video to be as long as it was, but congratulations to everyone for making the top 32 here. And the top 8 teams specifically, I thought all had really, really interesting counters, whether it be the Palkia here, the Whimsicott set here, the Ditto and the Lele, as well as the Entei here. You know, the 4th and 8th place Zacian teams are just really darn consistent. 5th place had the Naganadel. We had the, I think it was Scarf Entei here, and then Binja had some really interesting sets like the Bandlanders and the White Herb on the Stack Attack as well. So I think that's one thing you're basically going to see a lot of in this format is people finding creative ways and turning a Pokemon that you might expect to be run only in one way and basically turning it upside down and finding some like new items or new moves to run on said Pokemon. So that's pretty much it. I want to just quickly break down some of the key takeaways that I had from this event before we finish off. So, my key takeaways that I've taken from looking at this event are, 1, don't underestimate Palkia. This Pokemon was not very common in this event, but it was able to win the whole thing. So this shows to me that Palkia is legit, and yeah, it is certainly a threat to be reckoned with, right? Once again, it's not just Palkia, it's the way that these Palkia teams are composed of, but it is really cool to see Palkia take home such a big tournament win. As you can clearly see from the usage stats, early dominant restricted Pokemon you should expect are Zacian, Kyogre, Calyrex, Shadow Rider, and Xerneas. These are going to be the most common restricted Pokemon, most likely, right? I think, I would still throw like Groudon, Yveltal, Dialga, Kyurem into Pokemon that you need to heavily prepare for, but these 4 specifically are really dominant and have already been doing well in tournaments, and so make sure you prepare for these, like have good answers against all of those. And it's easier said than done, right? It's like, even if you have good answers, these Pokemon are all still just so good, like it's not like you're just going to win against them, but these are ones that you should absolutely prepare for. Eternatus is the main thing that I think is really interesting because we didn't see any of it really at all at a high level in Series 8, but here it is with a bunch of notable performances, so this is going to be a prevalent force early on in the format. In terms of item trends, more safety goggles and Rocky Helmet. Those are 2 things. We saw goggles a fair amount in the previous format, so that's nothing super crazy, but it is something that I think is going to be even more prevalent here, especially on the Poison-type Pokemon or the Steel-type Pokemon to help out against Xerneas, which was the next point I wanted to make. Rocky Helmet's good against the Urshifus, and then you're also, as I said, you're going to see some like item shifts, right? Whether it be Urshifu now running Mystic Water more frequently or Focus Sash on Alecki. We already talked about the common non-restricteds, but Landoi, Volcarona, Tsareena, Mienshao are all ones you should have on your radar early on in this format because those are all Pokemon that weren't very common in other formats that we played this year. Think about how you can tech in moves to help versus specific restricted Pokemon, even just one Pokemon that hits a restricted Pokemon for super effective damage, or teching in something like a Shadow Ball to be Calyrex Shadow Rider was a key trend that we saw from a lot of those teams. And then finally, your restricted Pokemon doesn't have to carry your whole game in this format. It is not like VGC 2016, VGC 2019, or even to an extent, like, the restricted Pokemon was still so big in Series 8, and it still is very important in this format, but I think without Dynamax anymore, you do have a lot more room to use non-restricted Pokemon offensively, and so now it's no longer about just, hey, how do I support my restricted Pokemon so that it dominates the entire game. I think Xerneas, for example, and Calyrex Shadow Rider, those teams will typically revolve around the restricted Pokemon more, and a lot of teams are still designed to support the restricted Pokemon, but I think a lot of the best teams I've seen have multiple ways to deal damage outside of the restricted mon, and that's like very important to consider as well. So I did not expect this video to be 50 minutes. I had honestly didn't know what to really expect when clicking record, but I had a lot of fun making this, and I hope that my insights were valuable. And let me know what you think about the format. I'd obviously talked about a lot of teams, so in future iterations we can just talk about like the winning team and cut down on things. But I figured more content is better than less to start off with something like this. So I value your feedback. Let me know what you thought about the format. Let me know what you thought about just everything in general. I want to make this the best possible product for you all in the future, whether it be in terms of video length, how I covered it, how I analyze things, what you think would be more helpful, whether or not you like the length or whether you wanted to be like a 15-20 minute video. All of that would be really valuable. So let me know in the comment section below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you all next time. And don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed. Would definitely like to know if people want to continue to see this on the channel. I'll see you all soon. All right, peace.